Wyoming Territory. May 1883, the rain started just past Cheyenne, cold and steady, soaking through Camden Sutter's coat before he even reached the ridge. He urged his horse harder, mud kicking up against the animal's flanks, his eyes locked on the white steepled church in the valley below. It looked small from up here, like a toy someone left behind in the grass. But the woman standing alone outside it, she was no ghost, she was real. She was waiting. Camden's jaw clenched. He leaned forward in the saddle, heart pounding harder than the storm behind him. The bride had not left. Not even after everything. He rode down the slope fast, wind biting at his face, thunder rolling low behind the hills. When he reached the churchyard, the mare slipped once in the mud but caught herself. Camden jumped down, boots sinking deep into the soaked earth. His hat dripped water in thick lines down his coat as he walked toward her. She stood beneath the awning, arms folded tight over a cream dress that had been beautiful once but was now streaked with rain and trail dust. Her hair was dark and wet, loose curls clinging to her cheeks and shoulders. She did not flinch when he stopped in front of her. "Francis," he said, voice rough. She just stared at him. "You came." "I rode the whole night. I had to." Her eyes searched his face. "It has been 2 years, Camden. I know. You disappeared. I did not mean to stay gone." Frances Tremont looked at him like she was trying to decide whether to slap him or collapse into his arms. "I thought you were dead." "I almost was." A gust of rain swept sideways across the yard. Francis stepped back under the awning and turned. "Get in here before you drown." Inside, the little church was empty. Candles had burned down to stubs. The pews were damp from the leaking roof. A small bouquet lay abandoned on the altar. Camden closed the door behind them. The silence settled like dust. "I heard about your father," Francis said finally. "Last spring." He nodded once. "I buried him myself. That was the only reason I left. He was dying. And by the time it was over, I was not the same man." She looked at him sharp. "You could have written." "I was ashamed." Francis turned her back to him. "You were supposed to be here. We were supposed to get married under that tree out there. Remember?" Her voice cracked. "Now look at us." Camden stepped forward. "I remember everything." She stood stiffly, hands clenched at her sides. "Why now?" He moved closer. "Because I cannot outrun it anymore. Because every mile between us felt like something breaking. And because I love you, Francis." "I never stopped." She turned slowly and her eyes were wet, but not from the rain. "You left me standing in this dress. You left me with nothing. I know, and I hate myself for it, but I am here now." His voice caught. "And if you still want me, I am yours, all of me. For the rest of my life." Frances stared at him, then down at the ring still on her finger. It had never come off. Not through 2 winters, not through the ache of waiting, not through the shame of small-town whispers. "You better mean that," she said, voice trembling. Camden took her hand. "I do." They stood like that for a long moment, rain tapping on the roof above them. Then Frances leaned into him, slow at first, until her forehead pressed against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, held her like she was the only thing that had ever made sense. Outside, the rain began to ease. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch of the church with the storm behind them. Camden's coat hung over Frances's shoulders. She had taken off her soaked shoes and curled her bare feet beneath her on the bench. "What now?" she asked quietly. "We could ride back to my place. It is not much, just 2 rooms and a stove that rattles when the wind hits it, but it is warm and it is dry." Francis looked up at him. "Do I get a real wedding this time?" He smiled, soft and steady. "You get anything you want." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You owe me a wedding under that tree. I will build you a house under that tree if you want it." She laughed, and it was the first real sound of joy he had heard in 2 years. I have to tell you something, she said after a pause. I was not the only one who waited. Camden turned toward her. There is a little boy. His name is River. He is too. He is yours. The world went silent. Frances looked down at her hands. I was going to send word. But I did not know if you were alive, and after a while I did not know if you would even want to come back. Camden swallowed hard, eyes wide. Where is he? With my aunt in town, I did not want him out in the rain. He stood up fast. Take me to him. Frances stood too. You are not angry, he shook his head. I am ashamed I was not there, but angry, no. Frances, we are a family, if you will have me. A tear slipped down her cheek. Then come meet your son. They saddled up together and rode into town as the clouds broke apart and sunlight spilled across the hills. When Camden stepped into the little house on the edge of town, a boy with dark curls and wide, curious eyes looked up from the floor. He was stacking wooden blocks, humming something tuneless to himself. River, Frances whispered, kneeling beside him. This is Camden. He is your father. The boy blinked, then stood up and walked over. He did not say anything at first, just looked up at Camden with that same steady gaze Frances had. Then, without a word, he reached out and took Camden's hand. Camden knelt, his throat tight. Hey there, son. River leaned into him, small arms wrapping around his neck. Frances watched them, hand pressed to her mouth. Camden looked up at her, eyes shining. I am not going anywhere this time. She walked over and knelt beside them. He reached for her hand and held it tight. In that moment, the three of them, man, woman, and child, fit into something that felt like peace. And the storm was finally behind them. They spent the night at Frances's aunt's house on the edge of town, where the windows rattled in their frames and the stove gave off more creaks than heat. Camden slept on a straw mattress laid out on the parlor floor, boots tucked beside him, rifle within reach. He didn't sleep much. The house was unfamiliar, and every sound, River's small shifts in the room next door, the wind scraping the eaves, kept him alert. But mostly it was the weight of what had changed. A boy. A son. And Frances still wearing his ring. By morning the wind had quieted and a pale light crept across the walls. Frances stepped into the parlor, still in her shift, her hair loosely braided down her back. You didn't have to stay down here, she said quietly. I did, he answered, voice low. She sat beside the stove, tucking her legs beneath her. He asked about you after you left the room, wanted to know if you'd still be here come morning. Camden looked down at his hands. I didn't know how to answer that kind of question 2 days ago. I do now. Frances nodded, watching the stove tick and settle. He's gentle with animals, picks up beetles and talks to them like they're people. He's afraid of the dark and he hums when he concentrates. You'd like him. I already do. She looked over at him, eyes unreadable. You're sure, Camden, about staying, about us? He met her gaze. I wouldn't have come if I wasn't. She stood then, brushing dust from her skirt. We can't live here. Aunt Lou's barely got room for herself. And you said your place isn't much. It isn't, Camden admitted, but it's dry and the roof holds. There's land enough for a garden and I've got 2 good mules. I can build more. Frances crossed her arms, but not in anger. I've got some money put by, sewing mostly. I can help. Not asking you to, he said, but I won't stop you neither. She gave a small nod, then glanced toward the back room. He's still asleep. We've got a little time before the day starts roaring. Camden stood slow, careful not to let the floorboards creak too loud. Would you show me the mercantile later? I'll need supplies for the ride. Frances tilted her head. You mean to take us up there today, soon as you're ready? She studied him for a long moment. I want to see it for myself before River does. If it's going to be his home, I need to know what kind of place I'm putting him in. You'll ride with me, just me, she said. You'll come back for him tomorrow. Camden hesitated, then nodded. Fair. They left River with Aunt Lou after breakfast. Frances saddled her own horse, a buckskin mare with a narrow blaze down her nose, and rode beside Camden without speaking much. The road was soft from rain, and patches of mist still clung to the cottonwoods. They crossed the North Platte mid-morning, water high and fast from the melt. Camden led her through a draw thick with sage, then up a slope where the wind carried the scent of pine. When they reached the cabin, Frances pulled up short. The house was plain rough-hewn logs, a single stone chimney, a lean-to for wood. A handful of chickens scratched at the dirt near the door. She dismounted slowly. "You built this yourself?" Camden nodded. "Started it the season I left, came back to it after the burial." Frances ran her fingers along the porch rail. "It's solid, needs paint." "I got whitewash," he said. "Just haven't had cause to use it." She stepped inside without asking. The room was clean, spare. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a stove in the corner. She opened the door to the second room, smaller but with a cot already made up. Camden watched her from the doorway. "Figured I'd make that his." She didn't speak for a while, just stood at the window looking out toward the hills. "It's quiet here," she said finally. "I like the quiet." She turned to him. "I do too." They spent the afternoon walking the property. Camden showed her where he planned to plant squash and beans, where the well was good and deep, where the fence line needed mending. Frances asked questions he hadn't thought to expect: how many hours of light the kitchen got, whether the stove smoked in the wind, how close the neighbors were. They ate cold biscuits and jerked venison on the porch, knees touching under the bench. The sun dipped low, casting golden slants through the cottonwoods. "What changed?" she asked suddenly. Camden looked at her. "What do you mean? You said you weren't the same man after your father passed." "So what brought you back?" he swallowed, thumb brushing the edge of the bench. "He told me something near the end. Said the worst mistake he ever made was letting my mother wait too long. He promised her a better life, and he never got around to it. Always had one more thing to fix, one more job to take. He said the days slip through your hands if you're not looking close." Frances's gaze softened. She leaned into him, her shoulder warm against his. "We won't let them." Camden reached for her hand. "No. We won't." As the sun fell behind the hills, she turned to him and kissed him, gentle, certain. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything but gave everything. When they rode back the next morning, River ran across the yard barefoot, arms wide, laughing. Camden lifted him with both hands, the boy light and wriggling in his grip. Frances watched them, a smile creeping slow and quiet across her face. They were going home. The move took 3 full days. They packed Frances's belongings into 2 crates, one for the sewing things, the other for River's clothes, and the few books she'd kept from her teaching days back east. Camden hauled the crates onto the wagon himself, careful not to disturb the child's slumber on the porch while Frances stitched up the last of the curtains she meant to bring. River traveled nestled between them on the bench, thumb hooked through the front of Camden's coat, head dozing against Frances's side. The trail was dry now, the river lower, and the sun held steady behind a stretch of cloudless sky. They reached the homestead near dusk. Frances stepped down first, stretching legs stiff from the ride. River followed, eyes wide but quiet, taking in the chickens and the lean-to and the wind chime Camden had hung from the porch beam that morning. It was made from old spoons, tied with leather cord. The sound it made was soft and hollow, like the hush between words. Frances looked toward it. "Did you hang that for him?" Camden nodded. "Figured it might give him something to listen to at night." River walked toward the cabin, then paused at the threshold, turning to glance back at Frances. She stepped beside him. "This is our place now. You can go in." Inside, the boy circled the room once, then made for the smaller bedroom where Camden had placed a carved wooden horse on the cot's pillow. River picked it up, ran his fingertips along the saddle, then tucked it under his arm without a word. Francis leaned in the doorway. He never cared for toys unless they looked like something real. "I carved it after you told me about him," Camden said from behind her. "Didn't know if he'd like it." "He did," she said, then turned. "Help me hang the curtains." They worked in silence, Francis standing on the stool to press the fabric into place while Camden tied it off with cord. When they finished, the room felt warmer somehow, not just in temperature, but in the way that settled things do. That night, River curled up beneath a quilt Francis had brought from her aunt's, a faded patchwork of reds and golds, and fell asleep facing the window. Camden crouched beside the bed, brushing the boy's hair back from his brow. "He doesn't say much," he whispered. "He never has," Francis murmured, her arms folded across her chest. "Not since early on. The doctor said there's no harm, just quiet, like his father." Camden stood slowly. "I hope he'll come to trust me." Francis met his eyes. "That'll come if you stay true." They returned to the front room where the stove was ticking again, the kettle just beginning to whistle. Francis poured water into a crock and dropped in the last of her dried peppermint leaves. The scent lifted, sharp and clean. She handed him a mug. "You've kept it clean in here. I didn't expect that." Camden took the tea, his eyes steady. "I was waiting. I didn't know for sure if you'd come, but I kept hoping. I didn't want you walking into dust." Francis sat at the table, fingers circling her mug. "I kept the dress." He looked at her, puzzled. "The one from that day. I couldn't throw it out. It sat in a box all this time." She stared into her cup. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because it matters," he said. "And I'm glad you did." She glanced up at him. "I don't want another ceremony. No pastor, no altar. That tree outside's enough." He set his mug down. "You want to say vows beneath it. I want to speak plain, not for others, just for us. And I want you to plant something there, something that roots." He nodded once. "I'll find a sapling. Apple, maybe. We'll plant it together." Her voice softened. "Then I'll wear the dress again." Camden stood and crossed to her, resting his hand on hers. "That day, the one I didn't come. I see it every time I close my eyes. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure the memory of it gets covered over by better ones." Francis looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she turned her palm under his and laced their fingers together. "You'll have your chance," she said. The wind picked up outside. River stirred in the back room but didn't wake. Camden banked the stove, then sat beside her, their hands still joined. No more words passed between them. They didn't need them. The next morning, Francis stepped into the yard with a spade in one hand and a bundle of young roots in the other. An apple sapling, its leaves still tender with spring. Camden joined her beneath the tree she remembered from the churchyard dream. It wasn't the same tree, but it would do. It stood alone on the west side of the hill, its branches long and reaching, casting shade over the grass where River sat with the wooden horse in his lap. They dug together in the quiet. The earth gave way easy, softened by the spring rains. When they set the tree in, Camden pressed the soil firm, then straightened. Francis stood beside him, brushing dirt from her hands. "We're going to be all right." He looked at her, then at the small boy watching them from the shade. "We already are." Camden rose before the sun. The air was still and silver, the last of the night clinging to the trees. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him gently, careful not to wake Francis or River. The ground was cool beneath his boots, dew beating along the tops of the grasses. The apple sapling stood upright now, its leaves catching the faintest breath of wind, and he paused near it, resting his hand on the soil they'd packed down together. He saddled the mule in silence, and rode east toward the neighbor's claim, an older homesteader named Whitlow, who kept bays and traded honey for supplies. Camden needed nails, some oil for the hinges, and maybe a bit of help lifting the new doorframe he'd been shaping in the shed. Whitlow's place was a steady 2-hour ride, and by the time Camden returned, the sun was high, and the sound of a saw came from behind the cabin. He dismounted and rounded the corner to find Frances kneeling on a plank, cutting a length of pine clean and straight with deliberate strokes. "You weren't in bed," she said, not looking up. "I didn't want to wake you." She set the saw down and wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "You should have told me you were heading out. River woke and thought you'd gone again." Camden crouched beside her. "I'll speak to him." Frances leaned back on her heels. He wouldn't say a word for near half an hour, just sat at the table and stared out the window. Camden stood again, guilt pulling at his chest. "I'll make it right." She nodded, not unkind but firm. "He's small, but he notices everything. You leave without saying so, it stirs up the old ache." Camden glanced toward the cabin. "Where is he now?" "By the creek. Took the little tin pail. Said he wanted to collect stones." He made his way through the tall grass, following the narrow path beside the cottonwoods until he came to the bend in the water. River sat half in the shade, his bare feet in the stream, the pail beside him already half full. He didn't look up when Camden approached. Camden crouched beside him, the water cold around his boots. "I didn't mean to disappear on you." River dug his hand into the current and fished out a smooth gray stone, then dropped it into the pail. "I should have said goodbye before I left this morning," Camden said. "I'll do better." River held up a small, flat rock as round as a button. "This one's for Ma," he said quietly. Camden took it from his hand, ran his thumb over its worn edge. "She'll like that." "You want to find one for me?" River nodded and turned back to the stream. They stayed that way for a while, the only sound the water clattering over stone and the soft thump of new finds landing in the tin. That evening, Frances cooked hominy stew with salt pork and dried peppers. River sat at the table chewing slowly, his eyes bright again. Camden told him about the beehives at Whitlow's place, how the smoke made the bees docile and slow. "I want to see bees," River said, his voice clearer than before. "You will," Camden replied. "We'll ride out next week." "Just the two of us." Frances poured water into 3 tin cups and sat beside them. "Whitlow's got chickens too, big ones." "I like our chickens better," River said. Camden smiled. "They like you too. You're the only one they don't squawk at." After supper, Frances stepped outside to shake out the rug. Camden cleared the bowls, then joined her, watching as she dusted her hands against her skirt. "There's a spot behind the shed I was thinking of fencing in," he said. "Would give you a proper place to hang wash." She looked toward the slope. "That'd catch the sun, could string a line from the post to the tree." "I'll cut new posts tomorrow." Frances leaned against the porch rail. "You think about building on?" "I have," Camden said. "A 3rd room. Maybe a loft once he's grown." She crossed her arms. "I don't want to live in a place we're always fixing. I want to live in one we're making." Camden stepped closer. "Then we'll make it." The wind shifted, and the air carried the smell of pine and distant wood smoke. Frances looked up at him, her eyes steady. "You planning to ask me again?" she said. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small length of blue thread, its ends tied around a silver button. He held it out. "We'll speak our vows under the tree after first frost," he said. "No preacher, no paper, just us and the boy and the land we're building on." She took the thread and slipped it around her wrist. "Then I'm yours." He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The days that followed passed honest and quiet. Frances pieced together new curtains from a bolt of muslin Camden had brought back, hemming them along the porch while River napped inside. Camden replaced the doorframe, sanded it smooth, and fitted the hinges so they didn't groan when the wind stirred. One morning, River stood barefoot on the porch holding a single egg in both hands. "Found it," he said. Francis set down her needle. "You didn't crack it," he shook his head. Camden lifted him high and set him on the rail. "That's your first. You ought to keep it." River looked down at the egg, then back up at his father. "We can eat it together." So they did, and it tasted like something new, salted, warm, and shared. Each day stretched longer now, the trees thickening with summer. The apple sapling held fast in the soil, its leaves darker than before, stronger. When Frances stood beneath it, River at her side, Camden placed his hand on the trunk. "We'll watch it grow," he said. "Same as him, same as us." Francis reached for his hand. "Then we'll call this our beginning." And they did. The first frost came late that year. It dressed the grass in white before the sun slid up over the ridge, brittle and fine like spun sugar. Camden had risen early again, not to leave, but to lay a fire that would keep the cabin warm for Francis and River when they woke. He moved about the room quietly, the wood dry and split just right, catching flame without protest. Frances stepped out of the bedroom, rubbing her arms. "It came," he turned. "It did." She crossed to the stove and held her hands out toward the warmth. "You still want to speak your vows today?" Camden nodded. "If you do." River appeared in the doorway behind her, wrapped in the wool blanket Frances's aunt had given him. His curls were longer now, falling around his ears. He padded barefoot across the floor and leaned against Camden's leg. "I'm cold." Camden lifted him, blanket and all, and sat in the rocker by the stove with the boy on his lap. "We'll have tea soon." "That'll help." Frances stood watching them with a quiet look that hadn't been there in the early days. It was steadier now, more settled. She reached into the cupboard for the tin of dried mint leaves, measuring them into the kettle without a word. Outside, the frost began to lift. By midday, the ground had softened again, and the sun warmed the slope where the apple sapling stood. Frances wore the same cream dress, reefed at the seams, the hem mended where mud had once stained it. She carried nothing in her hands this time, no bouquet, no linen gloves. Only River, who clung to her skirts at first, then stood beside her when Camden joined them beneath the tree. He wore the same coat he had arrived in months before, now brushed clean, the collar restitched by Frances's own hands. He had shaved that morning with the straight razor she'd given him for his birthday, and the cut on his cheek was still faintly pink. They stood close, not touching, their breath visible in the cool air. Frances looked up at him. "You ready?" Camden nodded. "You first." She took a breath and let it out slow. "I've never wanted anything more than a life that was quiet and honest, not perfect, just real. You gave that to me, not with words but with how you are, how you show up. I see it every morning when the fire's already going, and in the way River leans into you now without flinching." Her voice caught, just once. "I promise to keep this life with you, to grow it with you, and to never let you forget that I chose it and you on purpose." Camden's chest rose. "I never knew what I was meant for until I saw you waiting outside that church. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and then you gave it back without asking me to earn it. I don't have much, but everything I've got, my time, my name, my hands, it's all yours now. I'll spend every day making sure you never wonder if you're alone in this." River stepped forward and offered Frances 2 lengths of blue thread, one for her wrist, one for Camden's. He had tied the knots himself that morning, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration as Frances guided his hands. They slipped the threads on, and Frances reached for Camden's hand. No one spoke after that. They just stood there, the three of them, held together by the wind and the vows and the weight of everything they'd already survived. That evening, Camden walked the fence line alone while Frances read to River on the porch. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the field. He checked the gate, tightened the wire at the north post, then turned back toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. The windows glowed yellow against the gathering dark. When he stepped inside, Francis looked up from the chair beside the stove. River was asleep on her lap, the book still open on his chest. "He didn't make it to the end," she whispered. Camden crouched beside them and lifted the boy gently, laying him on the cot in his room and pulling the quilt up to his chin. River stirred once, then settled. Back in the front room, Francis had poured 2 cups of the blackberry cordial they'd made together in late summer, the last of the berries picked from the bramble at the edge of the property. She handed him one. "It's not wine, but it's something." Camden sipped, then set the cup down and pulled her close. "It's enough." They danced a little, slow and without music, just the creaking of the floorboards and the hush of wind outside. Her head rested beneath his chin, and his hand splayed warm across the small of her back. When they finally went to bed, the fire still glowed faint in the stove, and the frost did not return that night. Years passed. The apple tree grew tall, its branches strong enough to bear River's weight when he climbed them. He built a swing with Camden's help, tying the rope tight and testing it with his own weight before letting the boy try it. Francis taught River to read from the same book she'd read aloud that night, and when he was older, she sent him to the schoolhouse in town, riding beside him on the first day and letting him go alone on the second. The third room was built the following spring, its beams fitted by Camden and a neighbor he'd come to trust. Francis painted the walls herself with whitewash mixed from the river lime, leaving a handprint in the corner next to River's, smaller now than hers, but not for long. They planted vegetables and kept goats. Francis sold her sewing in town, and Camden traded lumber from the trees he felled up near the ridge. River thrived quiet still, but steady, and full of questions he asked late at night when the lanterns burned low. One autumn, Francis stood at the window, her hands resting on a new curve beneath her apron. Camden came to her then, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind and pressed his lips to her temple. "You think it'll be a girl?" she asked. "I think," he said, "whoever comes next, they'll be born into something good." Their love did not burn fast. It held like a lantern in the dark, constant, warm and bright enough to see by year after year. And in that cabin on the slope, with the tree grown tall and the swing still swaying in the wind, they lived out their days together. Not perfect, but real. Not loud, but lasting. And always, always in love.